Good afternoon. I see a lot of friends here, but to those who I don't know, my name is Simko. I'm from the class of 2009, and I'm speaking here today as not only a leader of the Gentleman College Alumni Union, but also as a former student of Professor Goodman. When news of Professor Goodman's passing spread this past May, it didn't take more than a few days for the GCs to pull together to find a way to show our gratitude for his years of teaching, mentoring, and friendship. And this red maple that we're dedicating here today is the expression of that gratitude. And like this tree, our feelings for Professor Goodman have deep and growing roots. And if I can, I'd like to take just a few minutes to talk about what those feelings are. Now, many may ask, and it's a reasonable question, why an a cappella group and its alumni would care so deeply about a political science professor who never taught music, voice, theater. You certainly couldn't sing or beatbox. And the answer is quite simple, though it may not be so obvious. The GCs care so deeply for Professor Goodman because he opened his heart to our outnumbered and out-of-place alums during those students during those first years of coeducation and beyond. Professor Goodman cared about underdogs, and it's my view that it was his identification of, attention to, and concern for underdogs that made him so special. So we tend to forget that the first male students that arrived on campus in the late 80s, including the first GCs, they were underdogs. They came to this campus and they found an institution that had evolved for 154 years to host and to serve women. That had been its mission. They were vastly outnumbered by their female peers. Many, if not most, of the faculty and staff that came to work here had chosen to work at an institution that only taught women. Many, if not most, of the alumni were opposed at varying degrees of intensity to having men as a part of this community. And so what was Professor Goodman's reaction to this? What was his behavior within this context? Well, he befriended the GCs. He encouraged them to take his classes. He attended their jams. He bought their CDs. Gail just told me something I didn't know a couple weeks ago, that he, more often than not, had a GC CD in his car. He welcomed them into this community, and at the time, that made a big difference to them. Another underdog was Wade Johnson, who Professor Borowiak spoke about. Now, that's a name that many of you won't be familiar with, but Wade was one of the founding GCs, one of the men of 92. He was a charismatic guy, a very smart guy, good student, a leader in student government. He was on what we would now call the SJ Executive Board. I'm looking for Sarah. And he was also very close to Professor Goodman. But when he graduated, he dealt with some very serious personal issues, and he ultimately died as a very, very young man. And Professor Goodman's reaction to Wade's tragedy was to strengthen his devotion to Wade. And so, years after Wade died, Professor Goodman and Gail dedicated the bench that Professor Borowiak spoke about. It's right in front of Napton, and I encourage anyone who's interested to take a look. And I remember that dedication ceremony in 2008. I know a lot of people here were there as well. And I remember Professor Goodman standing in Napton lobby speaking, and he stood at the podium, but he didn't stand behind it. He stood next to it, askew from it, not fully at peace with what was going on and why we had to be there on that occasion. And tears were streaming down his face, and his hands were having trouble keeping up with the tears, wiping them away as he spoke about Wade's potential, his unmet potential, his talent, his story, and his personal tragedy. But of course, GCs were not the only underdogs that Professor Goodman felt an affinity for. He cared about the homesick and overwhelmed international student by deliberately connecting class discussions to that student's home country. He helped the shy and quiet students who lacked confidence by meeting with them after class, by encouraging them to speak up in class discussions, by urging them to put their name forward for scholarships. And finally, Professor Goodman devoted his entire working life to Wheaton, which throughout its career has been an institutional underdog. Through the first 154 years of the history of Wheaton, it was devoted and dedicated to educating women in a world completely and absolutely dominated by men. Professor Goodman said, hey, that sounds like a good place to spend some time, so this is what he chose, right? He arrived on campus in 1965 to teach government, is what they called it then, to women who at that point had only been able to vote for 45 years. To put that in context, that's 12 presidential elections. But this is where he chose to come and teach political science to. He stayed true in the 80s and 90s as Wheaton took on the gargantuan task of transitioning to coeducation, a task at which larger and more powerful institutions had come up short. But this is where he wanted to be, and this is where he stayed. And in the last 15 years, the first 15 years of the 21st century, Professor Goodman doubled down on his commitment to Wheaton as it fought and fights to retain its character as a quality, 4-year liberal arts residential college in New England. Looking back on his 50 years of service to Wheaton, we tend to just take for granted that he was always going to choose Wheaton and he's always going to just stay here. He's always going to be here. He's always going to be mentoring in Napton and lecturing in Mary Lyon. And we tend to forget, and maybe it's because we've never thought about it and we never knew, that at many points along the way, he could have moved up and cashed in. But he chose not to. He chose to stay. And it's because we were a community of underdogs, and that was the company he wanted to keep. And so I now want to formally dedicate this red maple, which I assume will have leaves at some point. And to do that, I want to invite up GC students and alums to stand here.